Hi, I'm the Genetics Gal, and today I'm going to be ranting a little bit about an article that I came across in Nature, which was published just this past May. So this article is called Genome-Wide Association Study Identifies 74 Loci Associated with Educational Attainment. So before I go into the various thoughts I'd like to share, I want to start with a disclaimer. So while I do work in genetics, like all people who specialize, I have come to know a lot about a relatively narrow area of genetics. I specialize in epigenetics or chromatin modification, which I'll go into in a different video. But I certainly don't have a lot of the expertise that the authors that wrote this do. And so what I tell you is, I'm sure, just a small piece of the puzzle. I'm very open to feedback. If you have something to add or any corrections, please absolutely comment below. So with that being said, the first thing that drew my attention to this article is the sheer number of authors that are on this paper. So I didn't actually go ahead and count the authors, but there's 2 full pages that are devoted to authors and affiliations. Affiliations just mean what university or institute an author is from. And having lots of authors on an article is not uncommon. It's often seen with these really enormous studies where, first of all, they need to generate so much data. So there's just so much, human power that needs to be used. But also often collaborations can be really successful because they bring together people from different fields who have different expertise, that complements each other. So that's great. However, when you have 2 pages of authors, or technically the affiliations actually took up 1.5 pages, so when you have half a page of authors, that's a lot of resources that you're using. And so I want us to be thinking about, are those resources important? And we can judge that based on the findings that they had. And so let's dive right in. So what these authors were looking for is something called SNPs. So biologists and scientists in general, specialists, love our acronyms. So this is SNP. We tend to call it SNPs. And what this is a single nucleotide polymorphism. That probably doesn't clear it up. But basically, what a SNP is, or a single nucleotide polymorphism, is a region in the genome that differs between different individuals, or perhaps between different species. So basically, if we go to a gene in me versus a gene in my friend, is there going to be an A in my friend's genome where instead there's a G in mine, for example? So if there was, we would consider that a single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP. And so these authors found that there are 74 single nucleotide polymorphisms, 74 changes in the genome that explain part of educational attainment. So let's take a moment and look at what that dependent variable is that they tested. So they said that they measured educational attainment, which is number of weeks, or number of years of school. And it's true that they did measure number of years of school, since most people have had, say, between 10 years of school versus 15 or 20, who knows. But it's interesting because their ultimate findings were that these 74 gene changes could explain the difference of about 3 to 9 weeks worth of difference in educational attainment. And so not only are they only looking at one variable, which is the number of years that someone's stuck with their education, but also that they found that they can only explain about 3 to 9 weeks worth. So we have to say, are 3 to 9 weeks an important enough amount of educational attainment that it's worth potentially investing resources in if we find that maybe there's something we can do about these genes or something like that? So that's the kind of thing that I want us to be thinking about. Another important factor is that this study was done on people who were all over age 30, and they were all white males. And so science has, as you can see, something in common with the Oscars. It's not very diverse at all. And so even if we find that, even if there's this really important finding, it's worth considering, is this finding true of just the population they tested, 30-plus-year-old white males, or the population as a whole? We also might want to consider that the studies that we do on education are presumably to help people who are starting to get educated now, so our children. And so this study only looked at people who are over 30 and therefore are of a different generation. And so maybe those findings are relevant to our children, maybe not, something to consider. So it's really important to understand how large of an effect a certain study found. And so this is a complicated issue. I have a separate video where I talked about effect size versus significance levels. And so this is one where there's really, really good significance. They definitely found that there are differences that can be explained by the genes that people have. However, so effect size, one of the ways of measuring effect size is by looking at something called R squared. So I'm not going to go into here of what the specifics are, but in this study, R squared basically explains how much you can predict one variable by knowing how someone scored in a different variable. So how much can we predict about someone's educational attainment, number of years of school, from knowing what genes they have? Or conversely, if we know that someone achieved a certain number of years of education, can we predict what genes they have? And so the amount that was explained in this study, they had an R squared of 0.01% to 0.035%. So that was the range. That's really, really tiny. That is much less than 1%. And so since that's not necessarily the easiest way to understand this, so just to get a better sense of what percent of the effect they were able to measure, so this is 0.5%. And another way to think about that is, so I divided this piece of paper into 200 quadrants, and this teeny tiny little black square, that is what percentage of educational attainment they were able to predict from looking at 74 different genes all put together. They also said, and I won't pretend to completely understand the meaning of this sentence. I'd love to hear if someone can completely explain it. But they said, third, for each phenotype we tested, each of our 74 lead single nucleotide polymorphisms for association at a significance level of 0.05 divided by 74. We found a total of 25 SNPs meeting this threshold for any of these phenotypes, but only one reaching genome-wide significance. Again, I don't completely understand what differentiated the one that reached genome-wide significance from the others, but what they're saying is even of these 74 genes that they found, only a tiny subset of them met this other criteria that they consider worthwhile. So another thing that they did was they looked at what these genes are, what these genes are implicated in. That's a really common thing we do in my lab. After we identify a certain number of genes, if you find a certain subset of genes are involved in a certain pathway, whether you find that by looking in the literature or from generating data yourself, you then might go and look at what has been reported that these genes are involved in. And so the cool thing is, so they say there's this whole beautiful map that they have here. I'm not sure how well you can read that, but basically they did find that a lot of these gene changes were in genes that code for various aspects of neural development. And so it certainly makes sense that a gene having a different level or a different type of a gene for something that's involved in neural development could affect how well people could learn, or maybe how motivated they are to pursue their education. But one really important question to ask is, did they specifically test the hypothesis that these genes were ones that code for various aspects of neural development? Or did they just test lots and lots of different kinds of potential genes, and then all they've shown us is that a subset of the ones that they found are involved in brain development? So that's an important question to ask. And even if we say that it does make sense that these changes to genes that affect neural development could have an effect on education, like I could see how that would happen, but given that the difference in educational attainment that they were seeing was a matter of only months, it's kind of interesting to think what in how our genes affect our neural development could have an effect on how people succeed in education, but only has an effect of a few months. A few months is not the difference between having a PhD and not having a PhD, unless I guess you quit at the very end. It's a few months of education probably isn't going to be the difference, much of a difference in terms of how much you're going to how much money you're going to make or what position you're going to have. And of course, these differences that they're explaining aren't even, it's not like the difference between one individual having a certain amount of education and that same individual having three months more worth of education. They're looking at differences between people. So I've presented a few different issues that I have with this article. Not that this research shouldn't be done, it's just that there's so little research funding. So many labs really struggle to get funding for really important research. And so it's a little confusing to me why such an enormous amount of resources went into a study where we knew we could only explain less than a fifth of differences in educational attainment already, because we're only looking at genes. And then they find that it's even way smaller, half of a percentage of educational attainment can be explained by a huge collection of genes. And so we know that there's so many environmental factors that make a huge difference. And I think that it probably makes a lot of sense to start considering pouring more of our resources into things we can do to help people's environment, and not just trying to understand, as important as genes are, I think genes they're obviously fundamentally important to how we develop, and certainly there seem to be differences in educational attainment that can be explained by what genes people have. However, let's consider how important those differences are as we think about how to interpret these studies, and ultimately as we think about how to allocate funding. I would absolutely love to hear what anyone has to say about this. Again, corrections are welcome, thoughts, criticism, anything at all. Or if you have anything else to add about educational attainment or these genetic studies, or your thoughts on anything at all. Well, thank you very much for listening.